Oh, and just, once you close the public hearing, you can't take any input from anyone,
Right.
including the applicant.
Yeah,
Okay.
I understand that.
Okay, we're back.
Okay, is that 410?
What's
It's
that?
410. Thank you. Can't see, the lights are too bright between here and there. Okay, there being no further commentary or comments from anyone, we will close the public hearing. And now we will open it to discussion from the board. And I think we all have suffered from the same confusion to some extent. I hope that some of it has been clarified as to what we believe we are now supposed to do, as opposed to getting waylaid by considerations of short-term rentals and other things like that. But what I'd like first is to see, would someone like to comment on,
That's the Zoom meeting. That's okay.
oh, I'm sorry, I thought you had hooked it up.
You were live on YouTube with the
Okay.
recording just started. As well.
Anyway, would anybody like to make comments, clarifications from probably our attorney? I can't say that I can do it very well, as to really what we're supposed to look at and how it fits within, what we're here to do, as opposed to all of the discussion that was in the application, which is not necessarily relevant to what we're supposed to do. And I think that's confused many of us. So I would want to know, what are your thoughts? Paul?
I understand we're supposed to make a ruling on the setback, but we still take into account the intended use of the structure at the end of the day, and that's got to weigh in on our decision. That's a question for the attorney.
Okay,
You have to look at the fact that the structure is going to be occupied. They have
Correct.
told you that occupancy is going to be a short-term rental. So I think you can safely conclude that the occupancy is going to be residential of some nature.
Right. Okay. Thank
and
you.
that can then factor into our decision.
Decision.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, I don't think I'd gotten that far,
Yeah.
because when we talked about occupy, and somebody raised the issue of occupy as to whether that meant like a dwelling occupation or something. My understanding was that we weren't looking at what the end would be. We were just looking at whether we were willing to give it. So you're saying that,
We know it's going to be residential.
Yeah.
Whether that's family, friends, short-term rental, that doesn't really matter. Who's
Correct,
going to be residing there, but we know it's going to be residential in some form or another.
Yep.
And yes, you can consider that,
okay,
Okay.
although they have also then specified that it's going to be a short-term rental.
but we're not going to do that.
Okay. 'Cause that has
So
to
he
be,
gave us more information than he should have,
it's essentially.
for what we're supposed to be looking
Right.
at.
I think that the applicant was exceedingly honest with you about what they intend to do.
Yeah.
And that has caused some confusion and some consternation.
I think what happened is we all thought that if we granted the variance, that we would be basically saying, okay, you can just go in and get a short-term rental. You could go in, do it, go in and get a short-term rental. And that's not it at all, because they don't, I mean, even if we said, we can't, we don't have the authority to tell them to remodel it to be either a short-term rental or a residential unit. We can look at some of the criteria in light of the fact that that's what we know is going to end up happening. Am I talking myself around in circles?
Nope, I
again?
think you're doing okay.
This has been the most
Saying that the-
confusing.
I mean, I understand the public and how they feel, definitely, I get it. But are we supposed to be applying that simply to the setback?
So what you,
Because they don't,
so there are many purposes for setbacks. Attorney Bolt hit a couple of them. Fire, you want to make sure that fire doesn't spread from one property to another. Emergency services, you want to make sure emergency services get their air and light and that sort of thing. So is that purpose different in an unoccupied structure as opposed to an occupied structure? The impact on those things can be different. We heard testimony about, this is only used during the day and now there's going to be cars there at night and beams going in across the street. So that is certainly something the board can consider in determining whether or not it would alter the essential character of the neighborhood. Another thing you can look at is what do the other properties around there look like? Are there other accessory dwelling units on properties around there? If there's not, there is an argument. This is changing the character of the neighborhood. Is it changing the essential character of the neighborhood? That's something you have to decide.
Okay, because I thought it had to be super narrow.
Right, yeah.
And I was like, well,
The factors that we
understanding
consider.
that they want it to be a B&B or a Airbnb really is use and not
Structure.
setback
Right.
for something that exists.
But here, because
So,
the setback
I
is
was-
sort of
I'm like-
tied to the use.
Yeah,
Okay,
Yeah,
all right,
okay.
I get that now. Because
Okay.
before I'm like,
One of the things, yeah, well, can they help me out? Oh, I had already forgot the other one. That's what happens when you get old. Anyway, in the actual zoning
Yep.
regulation, which is these 4A low density residential district, which discusses, I don't know if you have it before you someplace, but it,
Page 10.
page 10. It's the variance is requested for the setback. And it says one unoccupied freestanding accessory building no larger than 150, et cetera. Well, this one, does that mean that any setback they're talking about is unoccupied?
No, so the general rule, 20-foot setback for all structures.
Right.
Right, and then we have two exceptions. Fences, walls, retaining walls can be within 10 feet.
Right.
And unoccupied freestanding accessory buildings at the time of unlimited size, 10 feet.
So actually what they're asking for is, it's not so much the 20 feet as it is the occupation, occupied.
At this point, it's the 20 feet because it will be occupied and it's larger than
Okay.
150 square
Okay,
feet.
so, but we have to agree that it can be
It
occupied.
no longer falls within the exception.
Okay.
So you just look at it like a regular building in your setback.
yeah, I just don't understand how the size of the building just falls into the setback exception.
Oh, because it was, at the time, it occurred.
Yeah, I know it was compliant then, but I don't understand why the relief,
Well,
they
think of it
can't
this
get
way.
relief
Okay.
for that as well.
Okay.
Why they aren't applying for relief for that as well, because it's. no
That will
longer
come
compliant.
when they go
Because they're
in.
no longer seeking the exception. Think of it this way. If you wanted to build a garage, if you wanted to build a 200 square foot shed, if you wanted to build a house, they all have to be 20 feet.
Yeah.
So that garage shed house could be anywhere from 200 square feet to,
Can I-
4,000 square feet. So the size of the house within the setback doesn't really matter unless you're looking at the exception, and we all acknowledge they're not within that exception anymore.
Okay, but I want to also go to the point that she was concerned about, which was the fact that it's there now,
Mhm.
And I think that's what you were addressing, is the fact that it was permitted at the time that it was done. Once this ordinance was enacted that said that within that 20-foot structure, between the 10-foot and 20-foot structure with setbacks, only a building of 150 square feet could be put in. So what that did, according to the ordinance, is it permits a structure that no longer conforms because of the ordinance's changes. It permits that to continue as it is, as a non-conforming structure, subject to Article 6 of the zoning ordinance, which specifically states that a use change, a change of use for a non-conforming structure is prohibited, essentially. So that when they can't go in for short-term rental permit, because they have to get a permit from the select board to change the use. And they'll have to get a building permit to build it as they want to. When the select board looks at the change of use, they will look at that non-conforming section that says that non-conforming changes are prohibited. A change from a non-conforming use to a conforming, non-conforming
Sure,
use
just
to
any
another
use.
materially different use
Yeah.
has to be considered when they make their decision as to whether they will permit this use at all.
Right.
So I mean, it's interweaving of all of that, but the fact that this is non-conforming, the fact that it is non-conforming now, from our perspective, doesn't preclude us to say, okay, they can have their variance, but as I say, they have to, the non-conforming use has to be considered with all the other stuff. All the other requirements, excuse me.
Okay.
I know, I'm trying to weave your way through.
No,
so-
I
so you
understand what you're
understand how
saying.
that-
I'm just looking at two things that
Yeah.
are wrong here presently.
Yeah.
Even though they were allowed then.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, but I'm only supposed to look at setback. Well, I see a big structure there also.
Yeah,
But I'm just supposed to include that
Yeah.
in
that is,
this
yeah,
because it's so, that's.
that comes
And-
down
and-
further.
In making a decision on the setback, I can't not look at the size of the building and not, and how it's going to be occupied.
Yeah.
It's.
Yeah, and well, I think that
It's
goes
not
to,
a 200-foot shed.
Yeah. Yeah.
That they're gonna put a sink in.
Yeah.
You know, so it's
I think,
different, so that's
that
why
will-
I'm
and that
trying to, in my brain, understand.
You shouldn't be participating at this point. Okay.
Is
I-
that,
no,
Make
I
sense, or
agree.
am I being
It's
stupid?
it's
No, you're
very
not being
difficult,
stupid.
but you have to understand that the structure that's there now is permitted to be there as such because it has been granted non-conforming status. And that doesn't, when they changed that law, they didn't make them tear it down.
okay,
Or that, not that law, that
right, that
regulation.
makes sense.
What they did was they said, okay, you can remain there as a non-conforming structure, but there are limitations on what you can do with this non-conforming structure. And those are the ones that, I was discussing, changing the use is one of them.
I think Tom had a
So
comment
you
too.
discussed, so on behalf of the owners, they now, if we do not grant this, they still have a building that can be used for, not for residential, but can be used as an office, a day office.
I don't know whether an office would be a permitted use. I know that under your
So
ordinance.
my question is, what are they gonna do with this building?
I don't know what they're gonna do with this
If-
building. I
if-
can tell you what's permitted to be done with this building.
So
Because
store things in it?
Yep.
and-
They can store,
They can make it a greenhouse, a tool shed, a playhouse,
they can use it as an artisan studio,
A
as
studio.
Mark did,
Yeah.
Mark DeBona did,
a dog kennel.
the dollhouse.
So they could use it for daytime
Yeah.
occupied.
Yeah.
Activities.
Those are all acceptable accessory uses. Yeah, they could, in low density residential, the LDR, low density residential.
So if we're not voting to cause this building to have no value at all.
No,
If you deny the variance, the building can still be used as it
It'd
is
still be
today.
used for what it was
Yeah.
used for
Right.
before.
Yes.
we're primarily saying we're not going to grant a variance to allow them to put in water and sewer and occupy it. We're not changing that. Because none of those are permitted with water and sewage, and that kind of an accessory use. I know, it's
It's
difficult to
intertwined,
separate
yeah.
out what they want to do with everything that they've said with what our jurisdiction is.
If we vote to deny this variance, we have to make sure we don't denigrate the existing building.
If you vote to deny this variance, nothing changes about the existing
No.
building. It can stay in its exact same place and be used for the exact same reasons.
If they don't want to use it as an artisan studio, they can obviously use it for a large tool shed, And Barry, you got any specific thoughts on it or? Nope. Well, should we go through some of the criteria? Okay. And this is where Laura will have to help us with some of the case law, et cetera, or interpretation of these variances because of these criteria. You have them printed in here? Yeah. Okay. The variance will not be contrary to the public interest.
And I would encourage you to discuss this in conjunction
Yes,
with the spirit of the ordinance.
yes, right, with the spirit of the ordinance, because those two really are very closely related. And the public interest would include that particular neighborhood and the property, the community.
Right,
it.
whether we would alter the essential character of the locality by granting the variance.
Right. So, and I think that, I mean, we've certainly heard from the people that live in that community that they feel that it would, and I think that when I look at it, and I know, and I don't live in a neighborhood like that, but I know that the basic consideration, or I am convinced that the basic consideration in purchasing that was so that they could have their lot as a residential unit, knowing that the people around them are all going to be residents as well. And when you look at the requirements for a LDR, for this structure, the dwelling structure, it can only take up 25% of the lot and the minimum lot has to be at least a half an acre. So my view is that part of this whole spirit of the ordinance is observed, et cetera, goes to the fact that these people are considering that if I can only put 25% of my property can be a, dwelling, or any, I mean, all structures have to be within that 25% of the property. That is because they are trying to protect the surrounding area as well, to make sure that there's lots of buffer and that people have the privacy and the non-encroachment that they want from other people and, well, actually even dwellings, although this one it's not a dwelling, it's a structure, but from that kind of use. And I feel that if we start allowing, especially this close, I'm not sure that any in that area, I mean, it's not permitted now to have a detached building as a thing. They can rent out their own home for a short-term rental, and they just go in for a permit. They don't have to do anything about that. But to do a detached building, they're going to have to get permission to actually build one. And I don't believe this is something that the planning board has even addressed yet, as to whether you can build a detached building on a residential LDR lot for a short-term rental. I mean, I don't know that they've addressed that, because it certainly doesn't appear to be addressed in the short-term rental provisions. But
But the ancillary structure for a second residence on an LDR requires it be attached.
yes, that's where it does. It's what's called an ADU. And that would be like a mother-in-law suite that has a locked door. And you could rent that out as a short-term rental, although it's, or you can get a short-term rental permit to rent that out on a short-term basis. But otherwise, it's the main dwelling, and there's nothing about a detached building being used as such. But that's not something we have to really necessarily consider, because that's going to be the select
It's
board.
outside our,
The select board is going to look at that when they come in for a permit to change the use. And then they will have to determine whether that's been addressed by the planning board, whether it's prohibited or not. That's theirs. But I think that all of those things go to the issue of, is the spirit of the ordinance being observed, and will it be contrary to the community's use of their property? And I do have a problem with that one. And I think everybody that lives in the community certainly seem to have a problem with it. You?
It's a single-family home neighborhood with single-family homes. That's what everyone purchased when they came into the neighborhood. And this definitely changes the character of that neighborhood,
I agree
in
with
my opinion.
Yeah, when you start putting rental units up separately on the property, it sort of becomes more, I mean, and I think if we think about it, the short-term rules now, and this is another consideration as to whether a separate dwelling should be done that way, how it will affect everybody else, is that you can rent your own home if you want on short-term rental basis, just get a short-term permit, rental permit. But what your care of how your own home is going to be used, especially those homes which are I'm not sure there are any over there that are less than $1 million. You know, your care of renting it out to people on a short-term basis is quite different from a rental unit, you know, that is only for that purpose.
See, now we're going down the rabbit hole.
Huh?
Now
I'm
we're going down the rabbit
I'm
hole.
now going down the rabbit hole. She's been pulling me out of that rabbit hole for days. Anyway, but that, I mean, that in part goes to how it's going to affect the neighborhood, you know. So I don't know that we want to vote on that one particular, but I think that, you know,
Let's discuss each of them and have
Yes.
one vote.
that's what I would
Yeah.
say, yeah. And because you may all have different reasons for why you want to approve or disapprove of any particular one.
Does anyone else want to comment on those two criteria?
No, I mean, I agree. I think, if the applicant was asking for us to change occupation so that they could work remotely and make that an office with a bathroom and a little kitchenette, it would be easier to swallow.
Mhm.
But knowing how they want to use it, you can't help but, how would that affect the neighborhood? If it was an office, they were working remotely, I don't think the neighbors would be as upset.
Right. Well, and it
So
would be the,
you have to consider the neighborhood. So,
well, and that goes to the issue of what the butter said about, you know, living across the street and having people come in and out, you know, if you're gonna have, they'll have minimum parking, which you have to have for 2 cars. So you could have 10 times a day, those 2 cars going in and out. Well,
yeah, well, I mean, we are just like, we're A in the alphabet.
Mhm.
They have a long way to go.
Mhm.
But, you know, we're not, if we say yes, we're not granting them
No.
permission to do this.
no,
They have a long way to go
I know.
and a lot of red lights along the way, probably. But we just have to consider
Yeah.
this setback and this, how these criteria, and we can't go down that rabbit hole of,
Yeah, let me ask Laura that also that, I mean, the limitation, yeah, I mean, the requirement that you have parking for 2 cars,
Mhm.
you know. That will, and a number of people, that will definitely probably change how it affects the across the street butter and possibly the winds as well. Insofar as their driveway, if you look at the lot, their driveway is right by that
Yeah.
building, and that if that other driveway has 2 cars coming in and out all the time.
I don't know the fact the required parking would have an impact, but certainly the change in use from an unoccupied structure used primarily by the
Yeah.
property owner to an occupied structure used by someone other than the property owner will cause an increase in traffic.
Mhm.
And I think
Mhm.
the traffic studies say that generally
Mhm.
speaking, a single family house generates
Yeah.
10 trips a day. But, you know, I don't know if that would be true for this as well.
of
Okay,
the number of people that could occupy the house be limited.
I don't know if you have any occupancy limits in your zoning ordinance. Sometimes there's a
Well,
limit
that
based
should
on
be
the square
considered,
footage of the
I
number of
don't
bedrooms.
believe under
If you
short
could
term.
have 2 people that
Right.
rented this,
Right.
that's different than 6.
Right. And that is certainly something the selectmen will consider when determining whether or not to
Yeah.
permit the short-term
I'm
rental.
not sure, and we all received in the mail, the new criteria for, yes,
Sorry to interrupt, I know it's unusual. If you will allow me, we will honor the neighborhood comments and we will withdraw the application.
Yes, allow
yes, that is
Yes.
allowed.
it.
Oh, I definitely, that's
Okay,
allowed. You know,
we appreciate the guidance you've given us.
Mhm.
And we had a different interpretation of where we should be, but we respect the feelings of the board. Okay?
Is that a permanent withdrawal, Counselor?
It's a withdrawal without prejudice, I
It's
assume.
it's normally called a withdrawal without prejudice,
right.
but I'm not a cheerleader. Mr. Chair. I can hear, but where things go. Okay,
All right, thank you very much.
happy.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you much.
Happy Thanksgiving to all and to all a good night.
And and you too.
I do have a question for the board.
Mark has a question.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, I just have a question. with- And you can answer this, maybe you're going to answer this when you close the meeting or whatever, but could you just make sure that if there's any action that staff needs to take, that we have it very clear before we leave?
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Enjoy your vacation.
Oh, I'm gonna sit right here. I'm making notes.
I know, I heard, I talked to Steve today and I said, I'm not sure I'll be able to reach Mark. I wanted to ask him a question. He said, I've already had 30 emails from him today. Yes, thank you for your comments.
So the application having been withdrawn, there is nothing that staff or the board needs to do, except to make a notation in the minutes that the application was withdrawn without prejudice. And that's really the end of what the town needs to do with this particular application.
And if anybody needs an understanding of what without prejudice means, it means that they can come back in and request a variance at a future time.
It voted and denied it, they couldn't come back and ask again, right?
They would need to come back, well, if they voted and denied it, they could ask for a rehearing and then appeal to Superior Court. But if they failed to do that, then they would have to have a materially different application or a change in the law to come back.
Thank you for all of your help.
No problem.
I think the board can thank our attorney.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, there being no further issues before the board, we will move for adjournment. Okay, seconded.
Okay, now good. Thank you.
Bye, Mark.
Right. All those in favor, before you leave?